So what is archaeology? Here we're going to examine some different facets of the discipline and their intersections. First of all, archaeologists do not study dinosaurs. As interesting as that topic may be, that is not what we do. Nor do we just look for pretty or valuable objects. As much as I enjoy the Indiana Jones movies, his ethics and methods leave a great deal to be desired. You never just pick up artifacts. Always has to be extensively documented and permitted before conducting any kind of collection. And the reality is we don't spend most of our time actually digging or excavating. A huge portion of our time is spent analyzing, interpreting, understanding, and writing about what we find and putting that information out to the public. And finally, archaeologists do not buy, sell, or put a price on artifacts. Doesn't matter what treasures archaeologists find, they don't get paid for the value of the artifacts. They get paid, as in my case, I'm a tenure-line professor here, and so I get paid to teach classes and serve on committees and advise student theses. That's what I get paid to do. The research is part of that, but it wouldn't matter if I found golden idols or a couple of sherds of ceramics. It's the investigation and the research about the human past that matters, not the value of the materials that we recover. And archaeologists do not appraise artifacts for people because that contributes to the underground market, especially these days in the international illegal antiquities trade, which we'll talk about more later in class. Archaeology, in a sense, is the past tense of cultural anthropology. We study subsistence, social organization, ideology, anything that people do or did is potentially subject to investigation. Other things that we do are ethnoarchaeological research, looking at how archaeological sites get formed, what are the reasons for things, by working with living people and looking at the material signatures of behaviors and activities today to try to understand how those behaviors created the archaeological sites that we investigate in the present. Also of increasing importance are heritage studies. What does the past mean to people? Who has a right to make determinations about the past? How does that past get presented to the public? Issues like cultural tourism and its positives and negatives. How do you responsibly have museums that educate the public and engage the public and get them to care about these issues while not exploiting the past and heritage and cultural materials of indigenous people, for example. Archaeology is also interested in human response to long-term change. Some of the change that is occurring now that we're able to see in terms of climate is one of the things that archaeology may be useful in helping us understand. How did people deal with this in the past? What were the effects on human societies and human cultures, human communities in the past during earlier cycles and events of climate change? What was their experience with that, and what can we learn that will benefit ourselves? Also looking at trends and processes of human cultural development. How do things change through time? How has history progressed? Why are we where we are today? How did we get here? The age-old questions, right? Archaeology can often provide a longer duration view of human behavior than is possible in cultural anthropology. We have what's referred to as longue durée, the long duration view on things. Rather than just being able to see a few decades, we're able to see centuries and millennia. However, it's much less fine-grained. It's sort of the 20,000 foot view of things over time, as opposed to the immediate personal kinds of information that can be obtained by working with living communities. But each has their advantage. Some of the work that I've done, for example, in my work in Baja California, this is a couple. The one of them on the left is a fish vertebra. The one on the right is a dolphin vertebra. Excavating the sites of indigenous First Nations fisher-gatherers from the island of Isla Cedros on the Pacific coast of Baja California, and trying to understand what we recover from the archaeological record, just these static bones, by combining that with working with fishermen that live and work there today, and asking them to share their knowledge about the seas around this island and the fish and how they're obtained and what kinds of behaviors they have that allow us to much better understand these seemingly mute bones and stones that we find can really improve our ability to interpret the past. Other people have done work with things like ceramic production, understanding how ceramics get made and used and discarded, and what kinds of decisions go into that process, again, enhances the significance of the data that we recover. Also, how people use the landscape on a large scale, how they move around the landscape, how they make decisions about where to settle, what kinds of resources they use, whether they move to the resources or move the resources to them, how they organize their social space, how they organize their community, how they organize their homes, and what that can help us to understand about the archaeological record. And a lot of these things you can only obtain them by working with living populations. And then you're kind of extending that understanding back into the deeper past. Archaeology is also a form of history. It allows us to get glimpses of the human past for which no written records are available. For the vast majority of human history, there were no written records. And even when there are written records, they're often written by and about only a certain small segment of society. If you think about portions of even relatively recent history of this country, the United States, the amount of literature written by and about enslaved persons of African descent in the American South is exceedingly small when compared to the amount of written record that we have written by and about the plantation owners themselves. So when we talk about archaeology opening up whole areas of history, it's not just that writing was invented or whatnot. It's about the vast majority of the human experience has been excluded from the written record, and archaeology is one way to break through those exclusionary practices that have shielded from view our understanding of a big portion of the past human experience. And the emphasis of this class is that portion of human history, right? And archaeology has a great potential for really increasing our understanding of human lives, but can also be equally important for providing a sense of history and heritage for many peoples who do not have a long tradition of written history, who have been excluded from that discourse by sort of the colonial mindset of, well, if you don't have writing, then you don't have history. And that's not true. It's not true at all. And archaeology is another way to break through that. For example, you could look at first contact from the perspective of the Europeans here on the left, first contact from the perspective of, in this particular illustration here, from the perspective of the Aztec. Very different views of this event in many ways, and being able to access both of those perspectives really increases our ability to understand some of these incredibly significant points in human history. It can also help us to understand, as I was mentioning earlier, issues of change through time. Here you can see a map showing the island where I work down in Baja California, when it used to be part of the mainland. As sea levels rose and it became an island, and then more of an island, and then even more of an island. What's really cool is that for most of this change in the landscape, people were present. And understanding that helps us to realize that their experience of going through the impacts of sea level rise, how did that affect the environment? How did that affect their fisheries? How did that affect their ability to make a living? Are all things that can also be relevant. So deep past is also important for us in that sense of history. Archaeology also helps us to look at questions of origins, migrations, domestication and village life, complex social organizations, technologies, the emergence of different ethnicities at different points in history. All of these things are things that we'll talk about here later in class, or in the course, I should say. Archaeology also can be seen as a science. It is a humanistic discipline in the sense that we study humans. But the materials recovered by archaeologists don't speak for themselves. We have to interpret them. We have to make sense of them. And so it's important to distinguish archaeological method from the archaeological theories that help us to frame them, frame the data in ways that make it understandable. Many techniques used by archaeologists are actually derived from both the physical and natural sciences and were not developed by archaeologists themselves to begin with. And one of the things that archaeology, some aspects of archaeology have attempted to do is to create models of human behavior, try to be explanatory. How do we explain certain behaviors? How can we predict certain behaviors in certain circumstances and contexts? Can we come up with general theories or not? Is that even possible? And also, what is the relevance of some of these particular ideas and models? Some of them can be incredibly significant and relevant, whereas others may model things that are already well understood. Humans need oxygen, doesn't really need a model of human behavior to help explain. So there's different facets and different components to the process. One of these you have is, how do you find stuff? Well, archaeological survey, traditional pedestrian walking around on the ground survey. It can be random, systematic, or targeted, depending upon what you're trying to understand. The way in which this is done can affect the applicability of the data to certain questions, right? If you are looking for, specifically wanting to understand material culture artifacts associated with copper mining, then your emphasis should probably be looking around where you have copper mines rather than out on the river valley floor. Whereas if what you're trying to look at is the general settlement pattern of a particular period of time, particular geographic region, then having something that's more kind of random and systematic, might be better. So it's important to frame your methods to match the kinds of data that you need to address those questions. You can also use aerial photography, quite useful in many cases. Ground penetrating radar and other geophysical techniques are becoming ever more extensively used in archaeology as we move away from trying to dig as much as possible and collect as much as possible to trying to preserve as much as possible and trying to disturb as little as possible. These new kinds of remote techniques are becoming ever more important. So this is sort of your very traditional old school version. That's actually myself in the upper story of a 2-story rock shelter on East Coast. Another way is with documentary evidence. The famous story about how Heinrich Schliemann located the city of Troy, the sort of semi-legendary city of Troy on the hill of Hisarlik in northwestern, what is today Turkey, by using documents and in particular Homer's Iliad as of investigation. Also important, local traditional knowledge. In many, many, many instances, the lost cities in the jungle that you hear about in Latin America and the Maya region, for example, they are only lost in the sense that the archaeologists, oftentimes the Euro-American archaeologists, didn't know that they were there until they were taken there by one of the local farmers who knows where there's the mounds, that are a couple of kilometers back behind where his grandfather had, his field. These places are not lost in the kind of Hollywood movie version of things. People still know where they are, and if you talk with enough local people in just about any part of the world, they have an incredibly extensive knowledge of particularly of that world. Sometimes things get found by accident. For example, the Templo Mayor in Mexico City. It wasn't that archaeologists and the National Institute of Anthropology and History of Mexico didn't know that downtown Mexico City, the Zócalo in Mexico City, was right on top of the center of Tenochtitlan, but they weren't exactly sure, how it was oriented or where the buildings had ended up with regard to the colonial distribution of structures. And so when they actually were digging for public works project there in downtown middle of the city, they actually ran into first the Coyolxauhqui sculpture and then the remainder of the main temple of Tenochtitlan, Aztec. And these discoveries are often the most dramatic and most televised portions of archaeology, but they're not always the part that gives us most of the story. But it's still really amazing. Here you can see an aerial view of the Zócalo. You can see right there in the upper middle part of the photograph the cathedral there on the Zócalo. And right there in the lower center of the photograph are the onion shell portions of the Aztec Templo Mayor that still remain. As we'll talk about later in the course, the pyramids in Mesoamerica, Mexico and Central America, were a lot like onions in the sense that there's a core that's built and then that's renewed by building around it. You don't oftentimes raise the whole structure and then build a brand new one. You just encase the previous structures in another layer of building. And so when they're excavated, or when in this case during the colonial period the Spaniards cut the top off, you had a slice through an onion view here from the air. And that's so the center of Mexico City today is the center of Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, in the past. So how do we investigate these sites once we find them? It can take a lot of different specific designs depending upon the questions being asked. We've gotten much better and more ethical about this. There are some horror stories about how things were done in the 19th century and early 20th century, again, that we'll discuss later. At its core, though, it's careful documentation, attention to detail, and context are absolutely essential at this stage. It's not about how much you dig. It's not about any of that. It's how well you're able to document what you're finding. Because otherwise, you might as well just go pick it up at the flea market, right? After it's been through 5 different hands. It's really, really, really important that everything be documented as clearly as possible, especially given the technologies that we have today, where we can do LiDAR and three-dimensional scanning and point plot everything to within millimeters. We have the ability to do this now, and we need to take advantage of that. You can see here, this is even a more, old school approach, but gridding out the whole sections and excavating everything in levels and very carefully and documenting and drawing everything down to the centimeter. In analysis, key things that we'll be talking about over the course of this class are dating methods, analysis of faunal materials, chemical sourcing of materials, chemical and physical studies of human remains, spatial analyses, studies of art, architecture, and ideology, and research into ancient technologies, all different things that we'll talk about. Here, for example, the idea that we'll go into more detail later on radiocarbon dating. How do we know how old things are? Because that's the thing. In archaeology, you have to control the space. That's the careful documentation I was just showing you. And you also have to control for time. When and where and when. These are the two things at the core of everything we do in archaeology. If you don't know when it happened and you don't know where it happened, then it doesn't really help you to tell the story or to answer the questions that we have. You can see different kinds of ways of approaching this and creating, histories of different places. Here you can see Oaxaca and the Maya region, Basin of Mexico, different time periods of different societies. Looking at chemical sourcing of materials enables us to look at studies of interaction networks and the development of ancient economic systems. Here you can see on the map on the right just a brief example of the different materials that were found in areas along the Ohio River and at the site of Cahokia in southern Illinois, where the First Nations of North America, all the way from Wyoming to Florida, up into Canada and Maine, all of these different materials and trade goods were all moving through these different systems. These people weren't living in isolation from one another. They were living in a really, really big world. And understanding that and trying to figure that out not only allows us to have a better appreciation for the sophistication and size of the world that First Nations people lived in, but also helps us to understand how those economic systems formed and grew and collapsed in different cases, and really is one of the more fascinating things that we'll talk about. Looking at studies of human remains in different contexts. The ethics of this are also something that we will deal with later in this course, and how respecting the wishes of descendant communities, especially when it comes to human remains, is absolutely essential. Looking at different examples of art. Here you can see examples of different sculptural and ceramic art from Mesoamerica. It's not all just broken potsherds and flakes and animal bones. Some of these things are truly beautiful works of art, and appreciating them on that level is certainly part of the process. Archaeology as a discipline is something that began with antiquarians, wealthy collectors of artifacts. Even some of the Babylonian kings paid for workers to go and collect artifacts from earlier Sumerian archaeological sites. So that collector mentality and having old things is not something that's that new. But early archaeology was a combination of several other sciences combined with history and geography and looking at the evolution of human society. 1817, Danish archaeologist Christian Jørgensen Thomsen opened the National Museum of Antiquities in Copenhagen to the public. And this, he was the archaeologist who came up with, you're probably familiar with some of his divisions of time for the museum. This is where the Stone and Bronze and Iron Age come from. So if you're familiar with those terms, you have Christian Thomsen to thank for that. And that was all the way back in 1817. So beginning a more systematic way of trying to categorize and understand the past. 1859, Origin of the Species, Darwin publishes his famous book, which, again, along with the recognitions of the 1830s of Charles Lyell and the deep time that we have available to explain what we see in the present and how it came to be, and what past people and experiences and histories there are to examine, really revolutionized our ability to examine the past. In the 1920s was sort of the time period when archaeology became a fully fledged scientific discipline. It's not that old as a recognized separate discipline from naturalism, right? In the United States, one of the things that parallels these broader distributions is the mound builder issue. The earliest settlers in the U.S., in what would become the U.S., debated the origin of Native Americans. And the early models where they said that, these mounds like at Cahokia and Hopewell and places like that, these are far too sophisticated to be the product of the native people's work, because these Anglo-American settlers were deeply, deeply racist towards Native American people and their abilities and their intelligence and their history. And so they couldn't imagine that their ancestors had been capable of building these incredible things, these pyramids and mounds and earthworks and all of these amazing structures. And so they imagined that it had to be a lost tribe of Israel or some Welsh prince or anybody, Phoenicians from, all the way there in Lebanon must have come through the Mediterranean and across the Atlantic, because the ancestors of Native Americans couldn't have been intelligent and organized enough to do this. You see how deeply problematic that is. As the number of investigators of Native societies in the past in the U.S. increased, anthropologists in particular and a few archaeologists began to study the people in the Southwest, sometimes referred to as the Pueblo people, as direct descendants of the first people in the U.S. And this began to result in a change of some of these perspectives, at least by people who were in the profession of anthropology. Then seeing a new beginning with the critique of unilinear cultural evolution by people like Franz Boas in particular. In the 1890s, Cyrus Thomas of the Bureau of American Ethnology published a report that had been decades in the making that established empirically that the mound builders were indeed the ancestors of contemporary native peoples. And so this is really important to recognize that it was hundreds of years from first contact until the first official statement that yes, these works and these archaeological sites are in fact ancestral to native peoples. So when you start from that deeply flawed and deeply racist beginning, it's going to take more than just Cyrus Thomas's report to change public perceptions and public ideas about this, and we'll talk more about it later in the course. Modern quote-unquote scientific archaeology with geology and DNA and dendrochronology and remote sensing and laser scanning and all of that really begins to take shape in the 1960s and really begins to increasingly be a multidisciplinary approach. No one archaeologist is able to know enough or master enough different techniques to do what would be considered a good job these days. And so almost all archaeological projects these days include multiple archaeologists working on a variety of different facets of investigation and working with different labs And so the old kind of myth of the solo archaeologist going out there is something that is increasingly rare, not because some archaeologists wouldn't like to do that, but because it's no longer really something that allows you to do the best possible job of taking advantage of all the different techniques and methods that we have at our disposal to do exceptionally good work. And we see increasing refinement of archaeology into a more technically proficient field. And now, in the 21st century, one of the things that is beginning to happen is that we're finally beginning to pay more, not necessarily enough, but we're finally beginning to pay more attention to some of the areas where we have not done well: public outreach, descendant community relations, diversification and inclusivity within the field on a number of different facets. These are things that are occupying a good deal of the refinement today, are the ethical and professional standards that need revision. The science and the techniques happen because they're often driven by people in the natural and physical sciences and physics departments and chemistry departments, and then archaeologists figure out how to use those advances. But where we're doing a lot of work right now is in these other areas. And there are differing paradigms of archaeology. Some consider it to be outdated, but there is a cultural, historical basis to archaeology. Figuring out what happened when and who is still important. Even if it's not enough, it is still the foundation of later questions which look at the different kinds of processes of change and how do you have the development of agricultural systems and traditions. Where do you see the emergence of complex political systems? These are important things, but you have to understand where are their complex political systems to begin with before you can begin asking those process questions. And then you can look at post-processual paradigms and approaches that look at cognitive archaeology. How do people think? You can look at multivocality perspectives too, because as we were talking about just a moment ago, the experience of the same historical event can be very different depending upon which side of it you're on. The experience, the way a Spaniard would write about the conquest would be very different than the way a native Aztec would write about the conquest. It was the same historical event, but the way in which people interpret that and understand it can be very different. That's true today, so that would have been true in the past as well, and trying to understand that can be really important. So that is